Now, as pathetic as it was me not landing a single shot in that sequence, that was one of the most badass clearings I've ever seen in this game ever happen. It was fucking amazing. And speaking of amazing, let's talk about AMD Ryzen. In the first processors that have been released and the first reviews that are coming out, the general consensus is Ryzen is indeed living up to the hype that AMD has set for it, as well as all the hype all the fanboys and the general computing world has been hoping for when it comes to a return to competitiveness from AMD versus Intel. Apparently there have been some issues with DDR4 running at 3000 megahertz effective on some of the highest end review motherboards. I think from Asus, with some of the review sites, they're having issues getting that DDR4 to run at the full speed that it really supports, which is unfortunate to say, but it's also, you could see it as a possible handicap for AMD Ryzen, possibly, versus high-end CPUs from Intel that are running quad-channel memory, like I think the i7-7700K runs a quad-channel setup, if I remember correctly. As far as actual CPU performance goes, for the first 8-core lineup of Ryzen processors, the Ryzen 7, which includes the 1800X, 1800, and I think it's the 1700 is the last number for it. But they're all 8-core, 16-thread SKUs, and they have been comparing pretty favorably against the top-end Intel products. Now, especially when it comes to single-thread performance, they do lose by a little bit, by not a large margin. They definitely don't have the issue of the old AMD FX processors from a few years ago. These cores are actually pretty well up to snuff. In a lot of ways, they're very similar in performance, I would say, to Haswell, the 4000 series of Intel Core processors. I think the Haswell comparison becomes even more true when we have to remember that Ryzen features 256-bit FPU capabilities, Skylake and Kaby Lake feature 512, which puts Ryzen at a arguably huge handicap when it comes to FPU workloads. Well, it is a huge FPU handicap. However, not everything is completely stressful, a floating point in vector performance. Of course, a lot of things are. However, Ryzen still compares quite well versus the Intel parts. There are some sources that say that the multi-threading implementation on Ryzen is actually in fact better than Intel's. But of course, Intel has the advantage in terms of per-core processing capability, the better FPU, and possibly higher boost clocks on their processors. Now, the big disadvantage for Intel is their prices are insanely higher when it comes to the very top end of what both companies have to offer. The top end Ryzen, you're looking at $500, and probably for a good motherboard, probably $150 or so. I don't know for sure. But for Intel, those top-end 8-core CPUs are definitely going to run you $1,000, and the motherboard's definitely going to run you probably $200. And then, of course, you need a quad-channel memory kit to get the proper use of that CPU. So for anyone who is completely willing to who really doesn't want to go with an Intel processor and wants 8 really good cores at a really awesome price, AMD Ryzen definitely seems to be a winner. The problem is when it comes to games, a lot of games really just don't stress 8 full cores the way that we kind of hope to. They're more or less going to stress probably 4 at the very most. And because of that, many of the conclusions are you don't need an 8-core Ryzen processor to get really great performance out of these games. It monetarily makes more sense to buy a really good quad-core that is probably going to be cheaper than the 8-core Ryzen, whether it's from Intel or if you wait for quad-core Ryzen. It probably just makes more sense to go with the quad-core if all you're going to do is game. I mean, even a modest i3 chip like Ivy Bridge or Haswell or Skylake or, of course, Kaby Lake, those are all more powerful than the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One by pretty good margin, especially Kaby Lake i3. Holy crap. Kaby Lake i3 is actually a pretty damn impressive chip for a fucking dual core. But I certainly hope that quad-core Ryzen basically kills off dual-core CPUs in mainstream computing. It's about time that they die. As good as the i3 Kaby Lakes are and Skylakes are, it's kind of time for them to just die. They have their spot in laptops, but they just kind of need to go bye-bye. Kind of like with 8-core Ryzen, I definitely hope and I kind of predict that quad-core Ryzen is going to take the gaming world by storm as the new budget CPU of choice. Kind of like how the FX 6000 CPUs were. As as kind of crappy as Bulldozer was, I mean, in reality, properly made games that could use all those threads, Bulldozer can actually run some things really well. I'll admit that. A lot of people will. But I definitely think quad-core Ryzen is going to be a huge, huge seller for mainstream and even budget gamers if Ryzen really is at Haswell level per core performance. Now, as far as year-to-year improvements go, I think next year, I think AMD really needs to get quad-channel memory support on their top-end 8-core Ryzen SKUs. I think that'll give them a big advantage, especially if they can keep the price very reasonable like they have been. I think that'll be a huge advantage for them against Intel. It'll definitely put the pressure on Intel. Of course, that's under the assumption that quad-channel would be even worth it for 8-core Ryzen. If the performance doesn't improve enough, then what's the point? There's no reason to increase motherboard and chip complexity and increase the price because of it, if there's hardly any improvement. But I'm sure AMD has been testing that. Of course, they probably went with the dual channel just to save a bit of money, probably for, you know, a couple % loss in performance, but we'll see. I think they also need to improve or expand the number of PCI Express lanes. I want to say that Ryzen 7 is 24 PCIe lanes wide, and then top-end Kaby Lake is 48. I'm not completely sure, and I'm too lazy to look it up. I'm sorry. But the other thing, I think the FPU width definitely needs to be expanded to 512 for the next generation of Ryzen processors. I think that's just a big thing that AMD needs to fix, especially when they don't have an integrated GPU on the die that they got to worry about that takes up space. I can't remember if the top-end Kaby Lake and Skylake 8 cores have IGPs. I want to say they do, but I don't know for sure. Now, it does save AMD quite a bit of money to not have IGPs, because that's just wasted die space. Well, these CPUs are definitely going to be oriented towards gamers and power users who are going to have dedicated graphics. Now, I could argue that quad-core Ryzen, especially if it's not a harvested 8-core Ryzen chip, I can definitely see a reason to have a very light, very small IGP on that. Probably just a couple of compute units, like 128, or maybe even 4 for 256, just to give it some decent IGP capabilities, you know, video decode for media streaming and media playback, you know, home theater PCs. It makes some sense there. But since future APU Raven Ridge platform series of chips, as well as these new Ryzen chips, they're all going to be using the same motherboard platform, AM4. So I guess an IGP equipped to Ryzen 4 actually really doesn't make any sense, because Raven Ridge is slated to have 4 full cores, and of course the large graphics array. However, I'm still left with the lingering question: is Ryzen 3 the quad core as well? Well, I know the 6 core is definitely going to be a harvested 8 core. I definitely don't see a reason why AMD wouldn't do that. But quad core Ryzen, I definitely hope is its own natively quad core die that's not a harvested 8 core. However, AMD has implemented some really good thermal and voltage controls on Ryzen 7, the 8 core. God, that's such a confusing numbering scheme. But like I said, AMD has some really good controls when it comes to electrical and voltage and wattage and electrical usage for their chips, and it might actually make quite a bit of sense just to use harvested 8 cores for the quad cores. However, you know, if you make native quad cores, that is a much smaller die, and the architecture is set up on the 8 core chip as to quad core, I forget what they call this, CCX core complex core unit, or core complex unit, or core complex, whatever the hell you want to call it. So it definitely makes some sense to just have a native quad core instead of harvested 8s being made into 4s. Although I'm sure we'll definitely see those anyways. Now, as excited as everyone is about the octa-core Ryzens, the quad-core one actually interests me the most, because that is definitely going to be that value sweet spot for gamers who really want a great value chip for making systems, and maybe to replace their older i3s, their AMD APU based systems, or their Athlon 860s, 850s, or Kaveri based Athlons. It'll be a great product to replace those with. I mean, you're definitely going to be at least doubling the performance at least. especially when we take into consideration those quad cores are, I think almost all those SKUs are going to have multi-threading. I think the lowest two are probably not going to, but almost all of them will. And if they come in at a very competitive price, right at the i3 price, the Kaby Lake i3s, I think Intel is probably going to panic. I already kind of predicted that AMD is going to give first dibs the quad-core Ryzens to OEMs, so they can sell it in mainstream computing systems, because you know these companies, they never wanted the AMD FX because it's just kind of a crappy chip, and of course the APUs had their place, but as far as delivering systems with more top of the line CPU performance, per core CPU performance, the quad-core Ryzens make a lot of sense for selling some pretty decent media and light gaming, etc. machines to the general public in your typical big box store like Best Buy. Once again, this competition does put pressure on Intel to offer better prices to OEMs and computer makers like HP, Dell, etc. To get better prices from Intel, or just to move over to AMD, just to kind of give Intel the big middle finger, since they've had such a large amount of control over this industry over the past 10 years. I still remember when Core 2 Duo first dropped. I am 29 years old, so I remember that just over 10 years ago quite well. Anyways, I'm going to leave it here. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Make sure to leave a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't. What I really want to see are some comments on what you guys think and feel about Ryzen so far. So feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you guys for watching so much. I will check you guys later.